But I realized, no, this is something that the body got stuck with, that keeps sending these impulses back up to the brain that says threat or mortal threat or life threat. So in learning, for helping people learn how to change that sensorium, that inner interoceptive awareness, then they can able to switch out of these states of hyper-arousal and hypo-arousal or shutdown. I mean, in a way, it's really that simple. I wrote that because there's such a poor misunderstanding, not just of lay people, but of therapists, of what is the actual nature of memory. One of the things, and in somatic experiencing, we don't go right to the trauma. We work peripherally with the different sensations, but particularly with bodily memories, procedural and emotional memories that contradict those of fear, terror, overwhelming helplessness. It's not, trauma is not just or not so much what happened to us, but it's rather, Freddie, what we hold inside in the absence of that present empathetic other. And that's critical.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today, we have the fascinating question of the different ways that traumatic memories are stored to think about, and how the body itself, and not only the brain, is instrumental in the way that memories are made and processed, and so in how we might ease the symptoms of those traumas later on in life. Now, we may tend to think that memories are stored in the brain, but actually we don't have a settled theory of memory yet, something that I'm really looking forward to covering the various possibilities of here on the show. So today we're going to be delving into the brain-body connection in traumatic memory, looking at the way trauma can influence our bodily states, and so in turn, the way that we can use bodily methods in a bottom-up approach to retrain the brain to feel safe and to integrate those traumatic memories. Now, for this job, there can be no better person than the psychotherapist that essentially discovered all of this, Dr. Peter Levine, the creator of the Somatic Experiencing therapy method, the founder of the Institute of Somatic Education, and the author of many books on trauma and on therapy, including Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma, Trauma Through a Child's Eyes, Trauma and Memory, which we're going to be discussing today. And of course, his brand new book, which this episode is very happy to celebrate the release of, An Autobiography of Trauma, A Healing Journey. Now, listeners, do remember that all of the books, the scientific papers, the concepts, and the conversation points are exhaustively included in the show notes. Should anyone want to go off, check the authority of all the research and the ideas that we're citing here on the show. On the website, there are even more if I'm unable to fit them all in. So please use them. I am a stickler for well-referenced claims, even if I don't necessarily agree with them all. Now, a quick thank you to all of you for your support on the project so far. Please help me keep spreading the word and sharing the shows with your friends. And if you can give me a 5-star rating on iTunes and subscribe with a bell on YouTube, that really helps get the show in front of other like-minded folks like yourselves. Also, please join us on Instagram and Facebook to be kept informed as the new shows come out. Keep feeding back to me with your guest suggestions and to leave your take on all of the subjects that we're discussing here on the show. Now, I have wanted to discuss traumatic memories and the body with Dr. Peter Levine since long before the start of this podcast, and in some sense feel that Peter, Stephen Porges, and Gabor Mate are in some way the holy trinity of thankfully our ever more trauma-aware society. So this is a great honor for me. And as you can imagine, I can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Dr. Peter Levine, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Very, very busy, especially with the release the book, but and just came back from a wonderful trip to Costa Rica. So I'm just settling in here, and I'm doing well.
Great news, Peter. Great news. Now, Peter, my listeners know that I love to start asking my guests about their first deep thoughts and questions about the world, about their life, when they
Mm,
first became conscious of their own reflections, usually sometime before adolescence. Before we introduce your life's work and the really crucial ideas that have contributed so much to the trauma treatment field, we're going to talk also about your new book, An Autobiography of Trauma, Healing Journey, which covers actually the early part of your life too. So feel free to pull out some reflections that you mentioned in the book, if that's appropriate.
sure, sure. Yeah, I do have an image, and because of when we moved, I was able to trace it down. But I remember sitting in my room and the shaft of light coming in from the window, and then little scintillating uh, pieces of dust that kind of formed the image of this triangle that was coming in from the window. And I realized at that moment, I think, as per your question, that I was aware, that I was self-aware. And I know you're not supposed to be able to be self-aware at that early age, but that's something I totally disagree with. I think it even starts earlier than that. But consciousness has a lot of different unfoldings. Consciousness. Well, let's think about probably the 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 person who's credited with consciousness in the Western world is Descartes. I think, therefore I am. And I think that was way off track because it's not, if anything, it's I move, I sense, I feel, I have images, I have thoughts, and therefore I am.
Yes, that's absolutely true, isn't it? And I know that you're very interested in Jung, who's one of
Yeah.
the great heroes of this show, and of course, his work on the importance of image and symbols, something that existed long before language, very, very important. Peter, it's a way of
Mm.
introducing today's main theme, which is about how trauma can be stored in the body and the method that you developed to transform it. I would love for you just to tell the story of how you more or less intuited your way into this trauma treatment therapy with that first important session with Nancy. Can you just tell us that story quickly?
I would say I stumbled into it. In the mid 1960s. uh, I was working with a group of men. I had developed a mind-body relaxation technique, and I had a group of men who had high blood pressure, and so I worked using this method with them and having them release a certain sequence of muscles. And in a number of cases, the blood pressure dropped from 10 to 20, 30, even in one case to 40 points. So my friend, very dear friend, no longer with us, Ed Jackson, he was a psychiatrist, and he was seeing this woman, I call her Nancy, and Nancy had been suffering from severe panic attacks and agoraphobia and many different physical symptoms, what we would now call fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, and so forth. And so he was wondering if some of my relaxation exercises would be helpful. At least she could maybe begin to get her life back, because until that time, she was unable to even leave the house without her husband. And even then, it was a horrible ordeal. I mean, it was a struggle just to leave the house, and she couldn't do that alone. So, and when she came in, her eyes were like wide, deer in the headlight, and her pulse was about 120 beats a minute, which is an indication of, in many cases, anxiety. And so I started to do my relaxation exercises with her, and her heart rate started going down. and down. And when you do something like, if you're a therapist and the first client you see and you happen to be lucky enough to have positive results, to have good results, you really think you know what you're doing. Well, I didn't know what I was doing, but I thought I knew what I was doing. So anyhow, I was quite relieved that her pulse rate was down to about 170. And then all of a sudden, it shot way up to about 150, 160 beats a minute. And I didn't know what I was doing. And if you can think of the stupidest thing that I possibly could have said, that is what I said. I said, Nancy, you must relax, relax, you must relax. And then her heart rate started going down to 190, 80, 70, 60, 55. And she turned pale and she grabbed onto my eyes with her eyes. And clearly she was absolutely terrified. And I would have to admit, so was I. But at that moment, talk about images and intuition, I saw at the far end of the wall of the consultation room the image of a tiger crouching and getting ready to spring forth. And the words came from my mouth, Nancy, there's a tiger chasing you. Run, run, climb those rocks and escape. Again, as I say, this was done completely at that time with intuition. I didn't really know until afterwards really what I had done. And actually dissecting this was an important part in developing somatic experiencing. So anyhow, it seemed like she was feeling even more paralyzed, because I could see from her movements of her body that she still couldn't really move. And so I encouraged her. I said, Nancy, here, I'm with you. Here, take my hand and let's run together. And then I could see her legs starting to shake and tremble and move. I call it sewing machine movements. And then her whole body started to move, and her pulse rate went up to a normal level. And then at the very top, I asked her what she was aware of, and she said, "Well, when you told me or suggested that I run, I tried that. I couldn't run. My legs felt like lead, like I was running in quicksand. But when I felt your support, I could feel my body starting to move. And then I could feel my whole body climbing up these rocks and getting to the top and looking down. And when I looked down, I saw the tiger, but I knew I was safe. The image of the tiger faded out, and a new image came up when I was about 4 years old. I was being held down by nurses and doctors while I forced an ether mask on my face for a tonsillectomy. And for the next 20 years, her body was trying to make this escape, but it couldn't do it because she was helpless. And so 20 years later, she was able to do that with the help of the image of the tiger. And again, you're talking about consciousness. This is about that motor movement that got stuck, that didn't get to complete. And that became an important component of developing somatic experiencing, these responses that our body tried to make, but we were overwhelmed, too young, too small, but they were still there, ready to be unleashed, ready to be accessed and completed.
And as you say, there's just so much in this, just that very first session that you went on to use. Perhaps you can start, Peter, by helping the listeners understand the three relevant different body states that she passed through there.
Yes.
The
Yes.
fight or flight, which it sounds like she was pretty permanently in.
Yep.
And then the freeze when it started to go down. And then the social connectedness that came afterwards when she was able to talk about this in a safe way.
And at the end, when she opened her eyes, instead of locking to my eyes, she looked softly. And I asked her if she was willing to describe what had happened. And one of the things that she reported, which also had an important impact on me, she said, I'm feeling like I'm being held in warm, tingling waves. And this gave me the first kind of intuition of the welded unity of transforming trauma and different spiritual types of states. So when she came in, her heartbeat was again at a high rate, and that's most likely the sympathetic nervous system. Then when she came down and then shot way back up, there's actually a thing that has this name, a relaxation-induced panic. And had I been smart enough, I would have coined that term, but I didn't. Somebody else did. But that is what happened. I mean, really remarkably. So that was another thing I discovered in trauma is it's not what happened to us, but in a way, what we hold inside of that empathetic other, that caring, empathetic, present other. Well, anyhow, our heart rate started again going down to a normal level, but it continued going down and down and down. And after that, I realized that what was happening was that she was in a very different nervous system state. My doctoral work was on the autonomic nervous system, actually. And so that gave me kind of a basis to understand this. And also around that time, I met who now then became a very, very dear friend of mine, Stephen Porges. And when I told him about this, he said, that doesn't make sense. And of course, he did make sense of it in developing the polyvagal theory. So anyhow, the heart rate going down is an inhibitory function, in a way, the opposite of fight or flight. I called it at the time freezing or collapse. And that is a state of shutdown. And that is the most terrifying, much more frightening than the sympathetic hyper-arousal fight or flight.
Is it correct to say that that is a remnant of the reptilian brainstem part of the brain where we see reptiles playing dead in order to get away from prey?
Absolutely. Not just reptiles, of course, but that's probably where it began. But almost all animals, I mean, from spiders all the way up to primates and human primates. This is a life-preserving physiological state. And unfortunately, people, when they experience this, when they have been preyed upon, they blame themselves for not fighting back. But the fact that they survived means that this mechanism worked. So again, there are basically three, perhaps four different nervous system states. The one when Nancy came in, her heartbeat going fast, that's the sympathetic fight or flight system. Then when she froze and she couldn't run, that was the freezing response. When she collapsed in helplessness, that was also a somewhat different response. And then finally, at the end, when she engaged me, looking together eye to eye in a soft way, not in a grabbing way, that's what Stephen Porges came to call the social engagement system. It's a particular aspect of the vagus nerve that's involved in our facial muscles and our throats and muscles in the middle ear. And all of those are tuned to make contact. And that should be our default mechanism. But of course, when we've been frightened, terrified, traumatized, we don't go there. We don't default there. We are stuck in that one of those two or three physiological systems. And in order to come back into life, we have to be able to switch out, usually from the freezing shutdown to a more sympathetic level, and then from that sympathetic level to this desire for contact, this felt desire for contact and connection.
Peter,
And
if you don't mind, I actually wanted to spend just a short moment on this because I know that Stephen's a dear friend and you both influenced each other's work a lot in those early years.
yes,
So I just wanted to dwell on that a moment. So the passage between the arousal of these threat responses of fight or flight or freeze and this calm social connectedness is something that we went into quite a lot of detail with when I spoke with Stephen here on the show when we were talking about polyvagal theory. So without getting too far into it, because I want to more focus on your work, I just wanted to draw attention to something that we spoke about in that interview that was really relevant to your body practice approach in somatic experiencing. Just as the vagus nerve connects the brain to the heart and the lungs, sort of activating them for fight or flight when we perceive a threat, so we can then use the breath to send a message in the opposite way to the brain that there is in fact no threat. And then we can calm down the nervous system using the body. So perhaps, Peter, you can use this bi-directional causality between the
yes.
body and the brain as a door to speaking about why the body and the bodily practices that you've developed are so effective. Perhaps you can give us a few examples of that sort of the way that bidirectionality has just been so useful in your work.
Yeah, for sure. This nerve, which now is called the vagus nerve, um, uh, that term wasn't known to Charles Darwin. And in his extraordinary book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, he talks about this nerve as being the pneumogastric nerve. In other words, it goes to the lungs, goes to the guts. And this nerve is, as I recall, I think he hinted about this. This nerve, which is the largest nerve in the body, the vagus nerve or the pneumogastric nerve, is 80% sensory, 80% afferent. So, for example, you go out your door and you see somebody has just been hit by a car and your gut twists. And then you go, you look further and you can see the person's really badly hurt and your guts really twist. Now, then let's just say that night you're going to bed and all of a sudden you see an image of that person coming into your awareness, into your consciousness. And then your guts twist. And what's happening is our guts keep telling our brain that there's mortal threat. One of the things I learned in working with military people from actually even starting from the Second World War, but Vietnam, and of course these more recent wars, is that what's important is that there's a message that goes from the gut back up to the brain that says the threat is over. You can come back into relaxation and into balance. And in order to do that, you have to be able to change the signals that are coming from our guts, coming from our hearts and our lungs, so so they run their natural course of action. And so one of the early things that I've noticed is, for example, when people usually these are the people with high blood pressure, their shoulders tended to be tight like this. And so again, what's happening is the shoulders are expecting, for example, being hit, yeah, and so they respond by trying to protect themselves. But this particular tension pattern is sending a message to the brain saying the threat is still there. So until the person this is the power of working somatically, because until that changes in the body, it keeps sending that faulty message. The twisting in the gut, it keeps sending that faulty message. And so what we've got to do is be able to really change that. And when I started to develop my work in the 60s, there was no definition as there is now of trauma as PTSD. It was a very different landscape. So I didn't know, or fortunately, I didn't know that trauma was something that was basically a brain disorder, or even a brain disease that could at best be managed by drugs and helping people change their negative thoughts. But I realized, no, this is something that the body got stuck with, that keeps sending these impulses back up to the brain that says threat or mortal threat or life threat. So in learning, for helping people learn how to change that sensorium, that inner interoceptive awareness, then they can able to switch out of these states of hyper-arousal and hypo-arousal or shutdown. I mean, in a way, it's really that simple, but something like that, at least at the time, hadn't been thought of.
You mentioned relaxation. Perhaps you could give us another example of the way that you sort of hack that bi-directionality to send a different message, to sort of update the message coming from the body.
Okay, well, so let me give you a couple of exercises, if you wish, and to do them also, if it wishes, or if you wish, or if any of your viewers would like to do this. Most of us have some tension in our shoulders. So if I ask the person to feel the tension and then to just notice what the shoulders might want to do if the tension actually even increased. So then it would go up like this. And then I would say, okay, now, but that's fine, but do it very slowly with awareness, with conscious awareness, just feeling the tension in the shoulders and slowly letting the shoulders rise and then slowly releasing the shoulders. And notice any sensations, feelings, thoughts, images that come into your consciousness. It's somewhat as I did with Nancy. So I might do that 2 or 3 times. And usually the person will report sensations of relaxation, of tingling, of vibration, those kind of sensations. Then with the guts, that's a little bit more tricky. What's going on in our guts with the twisting, with the butterflies. So I experimented with breath and many different sounds. And one of the sounds that I came up with that was particularly useful in switching out of that mortal injury response from the gut is to very gently take an easy full breath, and on the exhalation to make the sound voo, voo coming from the belly, and letting the breath and the sound go all the way out. So when I actually feel the vibration coming from here in my gut, when I wait for the breath to come in on its own, and again, people experience sometimes warmth, tingling, sometimes images, sometimes memories might even come up of where that happened initially. But the idea in somatic experience is not to have the people go to find, to excavate their memories. That may come up, but it's to switch the bodily state out of hyper-arousal, out of shutdown, and then into social engagement, into connection. So then again, this is what brought Stephen and I together, because again, my doctoral dissertation was exactly on this. And then, but I didn't realize it as a comprehensive theory. And I think that's the gift that Stephen has given to all of this, a really accurate model of what goes on in the autonomic nervous system and how that affects our entire level of conscious awareness.
Hmm. Now, another inspiration of yours, Peter, is from the animal kingdom itself and how prey animals that narrowly avoid death from predators on a daily basis seem to be able to just shake off this kind of traumatic survival episode that would lead to PTSD in a soldier, as you mentioned, or in a victim of abuse. And they just carry on without any apparent collateral damage. Just speak for a moment about the research on what is really the difference between the way we and they are processing those experiences.
Yeah. Well, actually, you hit it right on the head when you said shake it off, because that's literally what they do. And I've looked at many videos. I've talked to wildlife managers all over the world, and they all report a similar thing, that after a animal, a prey animal, escapes, it also goes into this immobility. And very often the predator is not interested in an animal that appears to be dead. Maybe it's a way of making sure that it doesn't get, pick up all kinds of bacteria or that kind of thing, so it loses interest. And then the prey animal, it's incorrectly called playing a possum, because it's not playing. It's again this profound physiological state. And then when the coast is clear, it shakes, trembles, and then goes off to live in another day. Now, the very sensations that take the animal, or of course, they can't report their sensations, but those sensations in humans, we become afraid of them. So the very sensations that will take us back out of the trauma, back into life, we resist. And the expression, what we resist persists. And uh, so again, we get stuck there. We don't complete that cycle as Nancy did, and we just keep replaying and replaying and replaying as though it's happening in the present, which keeps us out of being in the here and now.
Mm. And maybe this is connected to why movement's so fundamental in your method, right? You often speak about evoking vitality and exuberance in your sessions before you go anywhere near excavating the trauma. Can you expand a little more on the thinking behind that preparation, and perhaps comment on how we've become such a disembodied culture that doesn't naturally follow its sort of emotional intelligence, or should I say bodily intelligence?
Yeah, well, that's another interesting question of how we become so disembodied, you know. And I've thought about that. I've pondered about that. And I think that there was a period, and this is again just reading history and reading different renditions, that around the time, the late Egyptian, early Greek period, that people were more embodied. And I picked this up from the literature and from the symbology and from the archetypal images from that period of time. And but we have really lost that, lost sensing and knowing, feeling alive. Sometimes people have asked me, well, what happens in a session, or how do you know a session has been successful? And my answer feels more vitality, more aliveness. And sometimes when the person is starting to feel that aliveness, I might have them say, I'm alive, and I'm real. Then that will either increase or it will decrease. And what then often comes up is, for example, as young children, even as infants, we've learned that if we are too exuberant, that it may be too much from our caregiver, from our parents, from our mothers. And so we learn to shut that aliveness, that vitality, which of course is it's not just sad, it's tragic. Then of course, then adding to those ongoing stressors and trauma, we become even more and more disconnected from our bodily sense. And in a way, healing trauma in this regard is in a way of coming back into our bodies. In transforming the trauma, we come back into our aliveness, to our vitality, because the very um, levels of excitation that allow the animal to escape also allows us to escape disembodiment and come back into a more centered, more knowing, more intuitive place. And I talk quite a bit about that actually in the book I just wrote, the autobiography, how specifically that was for me in finding my way back into excitement, into dealing with some of the very profound traumas that happened to me in my childhood.
Well, we're just about to get onto that, listeners, and it'd be very, very interesting. There's so many things in the book, in your own personal story, that you pull out. Like the stuff we can learn from Nancy's session. But first, now we've set the scene. Let's go into trauma itself and this all important question of whether it's useful to think of trauma as being stored in the body memory, not just in the mental memory. And
That's right.
you wrote a brilliant book on this, Trauma and Memory, Brain and Body in a Search for the Living Past.
Correct.
Tell us about your research into this idea of body memory, what you're arguing in the book, and the way you've discovered that through all of this long career of many, many sessions. How is trauma stored in the body?
Yeah. Well, speaking of that book, I wrote that because there's such a poor misunderstanding, not just of lay people, but of therapists, of what is the actual nature of memory. And there are two basic categories: memories that are more conscious and those that are less conscious. And then there are two subcategories in each one. So in the conscious memory, we have declarative. So I remembered, I have a meeting with you today at 11 o'clock. That's my conscious declarative memory. And obviously we need that to go around, but it doesn't really have anything to do with what we feel, how we feel. There's also another type of memory that is sometimes called autobiographical, or, oh gosh, what's the other term that's using? I'll remember it or not. And this is a memory, like we're able to reflect on certain times in our lives, and it's a more important form of memory. One of the examples I give in that book is when I went from the fourth grade elementary school to the fifth grade. We were walking back from school, and my friends were asking me, well, who's your teacher? And I said, oh, Miss Kurtz. And they said, well, what is she like? And I said, oh, she's the most terrible teacher I've ever had, which was virtually impossible because I had teachers that were very cruel, that would have lost their jobs, maybe even gone to prison for some of the things that they did. So just in that moment of my bemoaning, I feel it tap on my right shoulder, and I look around, and it's Mrs. Kurtz. And she says, Peter, which she remembered my name, Peter, am I really that terrible? Well, it turns out she was the best teacher I've ever had. And so my whole perspective changed from learning as a chore, as something that was demoralizing, to really seeking mentors. And that's gone through my whole life. And even, again, I even write about that. But okay, but so why is that memory important? Because it really gave me, again, a new perspective. I was able to change my model to some degree of the world. Yeah. Okay, then there are, and these are the more implicit memories, emotional memories. So all of a sudden, for no reason, you're yelling at your partner or you're yelling at a friend, and they didn't really do anything, but somehow some little thing that they did, or the way they moved, or the way they smelled, or like the smell from tobacco or from alcohol, all of a sudden we're in an emotional memory. It just shoots up. But the deepest memories are what are called procedural or body memories. And these are the things that our body has done to protect ourselves, and may have been successful at the time, but then become maladaptive later on. And this was the memory that Nancy had about being held down and trying to escape. These are procedural memories. And how to work with all of these memories together basically is what that book was about. And to really understand which memory system a person was in at any given time, at any given moment.
It's useful to be aware of the different possibilities.
Yep.
Echoing one of Jung's ideas that I'm sure you're familiar with, that you can't solve a complex, but you can outgrow it. you work with this idea of sort of substituting traumatic body memories with stronger positive body memories, right? Give us a little idea how that might work and give us an image, because I feel like reprogramming isn't the right analogy. I don't think that rewriting is the right analogy.
No,
What's
no.
the way that you would describe this sort of idea of sort of substituting more positive body memories?
Yeah. You're not sure I would use the word substitute.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I couldn't find the right verb. It was annoying me.
Yeah, yeah. Let me give you the example from my life and what's in the book. At one time I was experiencing very troubling body sensations, procedural memories, and and certain images. I realized it was time for me to take a dose of my own medicine. And like Chiron, who is the Greek archetype of the wounded healer, it was time for me to ask one of my students to sit with me and to see what was going on that was giving rise to these difficult sensations, feelings. And one of the things, and in somatic experiencing, we don't go right to the trauma. We work peripherally with the different sensations, but particularly with bodily memories, procedural and emotional memories that contradict those of fear, terror, overwhelming helplessness. So in guiding me, what came up was an image of myself when I was about 4 or 5. It was my birthday, and my parents, in the middle of the night, had laid some model train tracks underneath my bed, out into the room, back down around, and then again underneath the bed again. So when I awoke, I, I I saw the train going around. I literally jumped out of bed, went to the transformer, changed the speed of the train, made the horn go, toot, toot. I was excited beyond excitement. And in that moment, I knew that I was cared for, that I was loved. So even though these horrible, horrible things happened, there was that base that my body could have this, as you said, this positive feeling, this positive experience. And then that allowed me to excavate this brutal trauma of being being attacked and being raped. Has a whole story there. So I was able to do that in a way that was safe, that I was able to sense it and move through it. And again, using those basic principles that my student, who was then my guide, was leading me in this direction. And for her, I'm grateful. But we've all, and maybe it's not so violent, but we've all had things where we felt threatened, when we felt helpless, when we really needed the support of another person to move through this. As I kind of mentioned before, trauma is not just or not so much what happened to us, but it's rather, Freddie, what we hold inside in the absence of that present empathetic other. And that's critical. That's critical. When I wrote in an unspoken voice, I talked about being hit by a car and being dissociated, being literally outside of my body. And when thankfully this woman came by and announced herself as a doctor, actually a pediatrician, which I thought, yeah, that's the right subspecialty. And she asked what she could do. And I said, please just stay with me. And she sat down with me, took my hand in her hand, and then I came out of the dissociation and used the tools that I had developed so that I didn't take this residual of trauma. And a statement is that without tools, trauma rules, but with tools, we can move from fixity to flow, from stuckness, frozenness to flow and connection.
Well, that brings us beautifully on to an important idea in your vision of transforming trauma, which is this being listened to, being heard, being witnessed, which I know is right at the center of your practice. And it reminds me of an indigenous American speaking of how in her particular culture, the legal system didn't consist of punishing the perpetrator, but of allowing the victim to speak publicly about their experience in
Yes,
front of not only the perpetrator, but in front of a series of witnesses,
yes,
thus validating the experience,
exactly.
informing the perpetrators of the consequences of their actions, unburdening the victim of the shame associated with their experience, which I have a question about in a minute about shame. In my opinion, listening is the missing component in our modern information ecosystem. And it's really led to a breakdown, both in democratic discourse and journalistic
Yeah,
nuance, but even in
yeah.
scientific progress as well. What role does listening have in the effectiveness of therapy and ultimately maybe in all of human social connectedness?
Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, it's about reflection, about, when we're infants and even from day one, you know, like sticking the tongue out. So just say the infant sticks their tongue out, and then the caregiver, the parent, sticks their tongue out. And then they're carrying on a dialogue of sticking tongues in and out. And then the baby gets even more excited and with this new learning. And the caregiver hopefully perceives this excitement and mirrors that excitement. And that sense of mirroring by that other person lets us know who we are. And maybe that's the very beginning of consciousness when we're just sticking our tongue out and having that mirrored. And I don't think there's consciousness without mirroring. So I guess we're kind of getting back to that question of what is consciousness? Consciousness is becoming self-aware from the sensation of what these motor actions are being described.
Hmm. And do you think, because I discussed this with Peter, with Stephen as well, do you think that listening is somehow maybe the missing link in perhaps finding a more trauma-aware society?
I think so. I would agree with that. I mean, trauma aware is so important. You know, um, I think it must have been at least 15 years ago. Um, Vincent Felitti and his colleague Andrus developed the ACE questionnaire. And it's a questionnaire of 10 10 questions, and it's either yes or no. So, was there alcohol or drug abuse in your family? Yes, no. So, was there inappropriate sexual touching? Yes, no. So, if you check yes to three of these or more, you will, of no surprise, develop as an adult or as a child um, anxiety, depression. You see such high levels of depression about the young today. I'm not saying it's all about this, but this is an important factor. And but they also are much more likely to develop physical illnesses like diabetes, heart disease, asthma, maybe certain kinds of cancer, and so forth. So this is so important. And I remember one time he and I were being interviewed together with Dan Siegel for a documentary that was being made. And, we were kind of in the back getting our makeup put on or whatever. And, I said, because this is the way it was at that time, I said, how is it for you that, this important body of work that you've developed, that it's not being utilized? And he kind of looked at me. I kind of sensed a little sadness in his eyes. And he said, well, medicine is that way. Things change very slowly. And they actually change quite a bit more rapidly than any of us would have thought, because in many, many cases, in schools, in clinics, in hospitals, uh, the ACE questionnaire is utilized. He also, and he agreed with this, left out at least two important aspects of that weren't on the ACE questionnaire. The first one was accidents. Kids are often having accidents. They, God forbid, they run into a plate glass door and they wind up in the emergency room or swallow a marble and they have to get their stomach pumped. These things can stay with the child if they don't discharge again that fear energy that was locked in their bodies. And
I guess my question, Peter, was around this idea that for example, could it be important to include on that questionnaire, did you have anybody that listened to you and heard your issues when you needed to sort of regurgitate and get it off your things? It's such an important part, for example, of the hand-in-hand technique, which is a brilliant parental technique for anybody out there. Peter's done a lot of work on conscious parenting as well, but listening is at the center of that technique, because your safe person, those people that you feel that social connected with it, that person will need to offload stuff that they weren't able to others. Yes. And if that person isn't there, then that accumulates. And I just wonder, would it be possible? Does it exist? Are there any studies into the actual causal physiological effect of listening as a way of not only avoiding trauma in the first place, or at least the accumulation of the consequences of trauma, but potentially even having effectiveness later on in life if somebody didn't have that when you were young?
Yeah, there is a term for this, and it's called resilience. And that was left out of, again, that ACE questionnaire, because yes, on average, people who have 3 or more of these events have these kinds of later problems, but many who have had that, or some that have had that, do not have those later symptoms. And again, I think that has to do with resiliency and being mirrored and being loved. Again, in my Autobiography of Trauma, that first memory that came, that first body memory that came of the trains going around, that really let me know that I was cared for, that I was loved. So even so many horrible things that had happened, this became like a foundation for how my psyche, my nervous system, my knowing body would be respond, and how I'd be able to help deal with these traumas, which were then, or what would have likely been severe traumas, but to be able to move through them. So yes, I think we need, when I was teaching about taking histories, trauma histories, I said, no, that's the wrong term. It should be trauma resource inventories. In other words, what was the thing that helped us get through that at that time? So then it was adaptive, but then then it becomes maladaptive, and then how can we change that? So I think those are really important questions that are not said. And in a way, somatic experiencing is about installing or reinstilling these core resiliencies in the body and in the nervous system.
Now, Peter, we must get on to your new book, An Autobiography of Trauma, A Healing Journey. Thank you for bearing with me. I just thought it was important for anybody who didn't know your work to sort of these pillars that are really, really important to introduce, to really, really understand your story. And of course, it's an autobiography. So this is your story. And by means of introducing it, I want to use the book as a way of introducing, and the last important concept that we've mentioned it, but we haven't yet got into it, this elephant in the room, as far as I'm concerned, with Western culture, shame.
Yes.
Listeners, I'm planning to do an entire episode on that, because it's that important. Now, you open your new book speaking of your own devastating childhood trauma, this violent rape at the hands of a gang that were threatening your father to avoid him testifying in a mafia trial, an episode that I don't think you've ever shared publicly before this
No,
book.
no,
Tell,
never.
tell us as much of that story that feels appropriate, the shame that you carried following it, and the maybe how that manifested itself in your body as you
Mm,
were a child, and how much of that was carried into adulthood. And
yeah,
perhaps you can use it as a window to speak about how shame has and can be just so crippling, and
yeah,
how you manage to disarm it.
yeah. Well, it's a long story, and shame is one of the shame is the murderer of the soul. It's the strangler of the soul. Um, yes, my father was called to testify against Johnny Dio. Johnny Guardo. He was the Al Capone of New York. In the book, I have a picture of him, and you look at that one picture, and you just get frozen. I mean, this guy is a murderer. He was featured in the Goodfellas and also in The Irishman. He was like the big hit man. And so, if my father testified, the way he said it to him was, if you testify, you'll find your family face down in the East River. So our lives were threatened. And this went on for many years. My father fought it. Eventually, it went to the Supreme Court. And so, in order to maybe, I think, tell my parents how serious they were, uh, I was violently attacked and raped in a park which had formerly been my place of refuge. And I never told my parents about that because the shame was so strong. It just almost obliterated or dissociated that memory. And in a way, I actually didn't even tell it to myself for many, many years, decades, until that session that I did with my guide, with my student. And shame is a specific bodily posture. So, and this is again coming from a body-oriented approach, from a somatic approach, because again, usually if you try to confront shame, it just intensifies the shame. And so a key then is to see how is the shame organized in the body, in the psyche, especially in the body. And so in shame, we avert our gaze, we look down, we look away, we break any eye contact, and our body collapses forward, and our breathing becomes greatly diminished. And again, so this is a bodily response that is that of shame. It probably starts initially around 18 months, 2 years, and then even more around the age of 4 years old, 3, 4 years old, 5 years old. And so again, if you can feel that sensation in the body, and I actually didn't write about that particular part, but in tracking those movements, remember, like the shoulders increasing and then decreasing, so slowly turning away and looking down, and then coming back, and then just feel the opposite response, because the opposite response for shame is pride and dignity, because this is the collapse. This is the physiological component of shame. When we come out of it, we open into our chest. We open into the sense of pride and dignity. And that was the case for me, that I did survive this, that it didn't kill me. It was horrible, but I dealt with it. And I could feel my pride. And that's one of the things that motivated me to write the Autobiography of Trauma.
Well, I can't help wondering why you've chosen this moment to speak publicly about such a private
Wow.
event. Is it to be witnessed, perhaps, or as we were speaking about, to unload this great burden, to know that it's not just with
Mhm.
you? I mean, you also mentioned the hope that this story will help other people facing
Yeah,
that trauma. Tell
right,
us
right.
why you chose to share this at this stage of
Sure.
your.
Well, when I originally wrote the book, it wasn't as a book at all. And in my age, so I'm now in my 80s, because clearly, I mean, I'm pretty vital, I think, but I'm certainly not going to be living as many years in the future as I have already lived in the past. So I thought this was a time of reckoning, of excavating my life. It's sort of like, I guess, a journal of some kind of thing. It was more than a journal. It was really to feel into these feelings, and I did that. And a very dear friend of mine, Laura, she encouraged me to write it as a book because she thought that it could really help other people. And when she mentioned that, I went, no way. And so I thought about. She said, "Well, why don't you just think about it? You know, you don't have to make a decision right now." And so I did think about it, and I would say, at best, conflicted. Often, when I'm feeling stuck in my life or in my developing my work, uh, I have a dream. And the dream really provides me with the answer that I'm seeking. So in this dream, I'm facing a large field, an open field, and I'm holding in my hands a ream of paper in each hand. And obviously it's typewritten, so it's some kind of a manuscript. And I'm looking to the left and I'm looking to the right. And again, I just feel at best conflicted. I don't know what to do. I feel lost. And in that moment, there's a breeze that comes from behind me and takes all of these pages up into the air and out into the meadow to land where they may. And when I woke up, I knew that the decision had been made for me, that I was going to write this book and eventually publish it as a book, to write it and publish it as a book. Many, many times I doubted my decision. I thought, I can't do this. Certain parts about my sexuality just felt absolutely too raw and vulnerable. But then each time I would come back to, yeah, yes, this could also help people and also encourage people to write their own stories, because we all have stories to tell that are important to tell for us, for our own sake, but also for others. And so that's what really, turned the table. Then finally, when I got a publisher, then I felt another kind of minor panic attack. Oh my God, because if I do this, then it'll come out. Then when I uh, gave them the manuscript, again, it was like, oh my God, am I really going to do this? Now, in an interview like this, I feel some apprehension, but mostly I feel excitement. I feel like I've done what I was supposed to do, and that was to put this out into that meadow of the readers, that they could use it for their own healing and to just in some ways to support that and to be able to use my experience to help them journal and organize their own experiences. So, I mean, again, I still talking about it with you now. I get a little bit of tightness in my chest, but it soon passes. Because again, like with dreams, I knew that I was doing the right thing.
You're such a figure in the field of trauma awareness, in the positive story about the fact that there is hope for those people who are trying to face those, that they don't just have to bury it and get on with it. As
Yeah,
my
yeah, yeah,
as my mum's generation would say,
yeah.
there are some tools we can do something. And for a figure of your importance in the field to come forward and say, I faced my resistance to this and I went through with it, I think is an enormously important symbol. So thank you for your bravery.
Thank
And
you. Yeah, well, this is the backstory in a way to developing this methodology. And and it also, I think, makes me more human to myself and to others. And again, I think that's a gift that we can give, is to share that vulnerability with a chosen other. You know, if you tell something about yourself that's delicate, that's vulnerable, you want to tell it only to the right person. And I believe that the people who will be reading this book are the right people to witness my story, so that all of you are helping me in my own healing, in my own individuation process.
In the book, you also confirm for yourself something that you've often spoke about that rings true with Jung, that
Right.
trauma can be one of life's greatest teachers.
Yes. Yes.
Does that mean, this is an important question that comes up in almost all of our psychology episodes, does that mean that traumatic experiences and painful challenges are an important prerequisite for the transformational component that Jung called individuation? Do we need them for that to work? Or rather, simply, as the great Jung scholar who I know you respect and you mentioned in the book, James Hollis, he said
Mm,
here on the show that a life without suffering would be hard to find. So
right.
maybe it's, rather than being a necessary part of transformation, it's just an inevitable part of life.
It is. It is. You know, somebody asked me what message I would like to leave. And I thought about this, and the following words came. Trauma is a fact of life, but trauma doesn't have to become a life sentence. Given the right tools, given the support that we deserve and that we can get, we can then move through those fixations, that fixity, and come back to the flow of who we really are. And in a way, trauma renegotiated, trauma transformed is that rite of passage. It certainly was for me, that takes us to a place where we're more empathetic and that we're more compassionate, both to ourselves and to others. And we don't ask the question, what's wrong with you? But rather, what happened to you and what's happening to you right now? So, you know, again, my colleague, Gabor Mate, he wrote something like, really, trauma is what brings us to this state of caring, of compassion, of deeper understanding of the human condition, of the
Well,
human condition.
and
Yeah.
he echoes one of your ideas. I wonder if he wasn't influenced by you. His compassionate inquiry idea builds on your much, I think you mentioned it many, many years before, about this importance of the state of curiosity.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah,
Because
yeah.
you say that if we move into that state, there's no way that can coexist with fear and resistance. It's a completely
Exactly.
different brain state.
Yep.
Let's
Completely
just
different.
close on that positive note. The importance of curiosity for you. Tell us, why is it so important that we have that compassionate, kind curiosity to ourselves if we want to sort of overcome our resistance to facing our traumas?
You know, sometimes I'll ask the person, there's a saying, I don't know if it's in UK or in Europe, um, but the the expression is curiosity killed the cat. And I asked the person if they've heard of that. And they said, but that's wrong. They got it all wrong. Curiosity is what led the cat to realizing its whole greatest potential. And as a child, I think this is one of the gifts that I did get from my parents, is that of curiosity. And I was receiving my first of four Lifetime Achievement Awards. And I was surprised that my brother John, my middle brother, he was in the audience, and I always felt that he didn't really respect my work because he's a very famous doctor, medical doctor, and PhD researcher. But I noticed he was there in the audience, and so I spoke about curiosity, and we went out to have lunch afterwards. And he said he described a memory that I hadn't remembered consciously. We during the summers we would live on my grandparents' farm, and we would take fruits and vegetables from the farm and put them in this red wagon and then walk about a mile up this dirt road, Pine Tree Road, to a bungalow colony where people from the cities would come to spend the summers. And how could they resist? There were the three of us, these three cute boys, coming with these wonderful fresh vegetables. Well, of course, they bought them. And my grandfather, oh, I'm sorry, Grandpa, to say this, but he was a tight ass. He gave us 10% of what we sold, but that didn't matter. It was that we were now growing up, entrepreneurs. So one day we had sold everything except for one head of cabbage. And we were pulling the wagon, and I noticed that the cabbage, the head of cabbage, rolled to the back of the wagon, and I was very curious about that. So I sat by the side of the wagon and had my brother pull the wagon, and I noticed not that it was the cabbage was moving to the end, but it was staying still, and the wagon was going forward. So when we returned, I asked my mother why this happened. How come this happened every time? And she said, Peter, you've just rediscovered Newton's first law of motion. A body at rest tends to stay in rest unless acted on by an outside force, and a body that's in motion tends to stay in motion unless met by an outside force. And I've always been that person of motion, bringing this world out to the world, bringing this work out to the world. When I first developed it, I was like Johnny Appleseed. He's the one who planted apple seeds all along the country, and then from those seeds grew all of these apple trees. And I don't know if it's a true story, but it's a wonderful story. And I was that person who just went throughout the world to get this work out. And it was quite a burden. But I originally did this with a group of about a dozen or so Berkeley therapists. And then, even though I still can't quite compute, this work is now being taught in 44 countries by 50 or 60 of the people who are the trainers now, ones that I've trained and other trainers have trained. And so as to the question, have I done enough? I can answer that in the affirmative. Yes, I have done enough. It's out in the world. I can let go. I don't have to feel like I have to keep doing something. I can just kind of hang out and write books if I want, and do things and go to wonderful places to play and to live and to support my happiness, really. And
well, Peter, your vibrancy and your vitality and your exuberance have been fundamental to having the energy to not only create and develop somatic experiencing and treat so many people, but also to create the institute, to make it into something that could be shared. I've met myself in person at least 10 people who have been pursuing your training. It is having a huge effect. So I think you're absolutely right. You have done enough.
But the lingering question is, am I enough? That's the work in progress. And each day, it seems like I am more and more able to answer that question in the affirmative. So I just leave you all with that thought, and to find your own thoughts and your feelings, and to tell yourself your stories.
Dr. Peter Levine, thank you so much for opening your heart and for a life of extraordinary commitment to a trauma-aware society and to providing tools that we can actually all access. Listeners, do please go off and read this touching, beautiful insight. As we know, stories are often the best way to access the truth behind and the facts and the science behind. So This is a really beautiful book, An Autobiography of
Thank you.
Trauma, A Healing Journey.
By
Thank
the
you.
way, you can, wherever books are sold, you can get it. It's actually, I have to, no. Oh, yes, I will tell you. I just looked, it was released yesterday. I just looked, I think on Amazon, and it was #1 new release. And I thought, holy S dash dash T. It's out there. I cannot take it back now.
Well, Peter, I wish you all the best with the book. It is definitely going to be a different world for you, knowing that everybody knows that. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, we can learn a huge amount from this brave, brave story. And most of all, the extraordinary amount of experience you can put into that story and unfold as you do in the book. So thank you so, so much for your time and all the best with the book, Peter.
It was really enjoyable meeting you, Freddie.